What is up, guys? Lord Nick here, bringing you another One Piece related video. In this video, guys, we're going to be talking about how to pilot Rebecca, the turn-by-turn breakdown for this deck. I was asked if I could do a turn-by-turn breakdown, going over the best plays, the best play lines, kind of the options, and kind of uniquely how you should be approaching it. The play of Rebecca in more of a generic sense, just to kind of give people who are newer to the deck, because we're finding that quite a few newer folks are starting to show up, just what it is that they're, what they need to do to be able to accomplish this. So we are going to go over it a little bit today. We're going to be going over all that, and before we jump into the nitty-gritty of everything, if you guys did not know this already, I've started up a Discord for us to have a Rebecca Mains Discord, so we could have a lot more discourse talks and just kind of be able to theory craft and kind of organize our talks a little bit better than just on the traditional OP Discord. So that will be found in the description below. If you haven't joined, feel free to join. I'll be jumping in conversations here or there. I am relatively busy, unfortunately, so like with the semester going on, my two jobs going on right now, it is occupying a decent amount of my time. So I will be still trying to get out 2 videos a week if I can. On top of that, I'm going to be trying to do interactions on the Discord and hopefully be able to get some games jammed in there. But we will be continuing the series that I started last week as well. But anyhow, let's jump into it, guys. And so one of the big first things that we kind of need to discuss here is going to be odd curve versus even curve, which is the more preferred pick for Rebecca, and then we're going to go later into how you play on either of them. And the biggest thing that you guys need to be focused on is if you have the option, which one should you pick? And hands down, I think it's the even curve. One, you get the card advantage. We are a slow, grindy deck, so more resources is always better. On top of that, most of our early game cards are odd curved, which it means that to be able to utilize our leader ability, even curve is actually better. So would you prefer to be able on turn 2 just play a Kyros, or would you prefer to play Kyros, use leader ability? I prefer the second one, as it maintains card advantage for us. On top of that, it doesn't change what turn we're dropping the Kyros. And it doesn't matter if we're going first or second in that regard. Our leader is not going to be able to swing either way. So going second is just more optimal because we're getting more Dawn efficiency. We're getting more utility out of going second. It also opens up for 4-drop cards, which would be like Rebecca and Orlumbus, to be able to be played. So we actually have more versatility of what we can play going second. Now, what cards do you want? Well, in general, the 2 cards that you almost always want to see early would be Colosseum and Kyros. Now, you don't have to have either of these early. If you don't have the Kyros, it's a lot harder. But if you don't have the Colosseum, you just learn to play without Colosseum mainly, and that's why my main list that was showcased in my most recent video, and will be showcased in the video that I post later this week, showcasing gameplay and such like that, I cut it down to 2 Colosseums, because unless you're running 4, your consistency of seeing it super early is more or less luck-based, and so we need to use cards to either find it or just play without it. Now, when do we want to get aggressive with Rebecca? So this is going to be this is a question I've kind of seen by a lot of folks. Like, when do you start going for life? Where do we start playing for that, right? That's kind of where aggression comes in. Do we constantly just go for board? Do we try to overflood the board at a certain point? Do we start attacking life? So it really kind of comes down to a matchup dependent breakdown. Against aggro decks, we kind of want to get chip damage in. So Kyroses are important so that we can chip at their life. Because if aggro decks have a lot of cards in hand, that doesn't mean a whole lot other than they're going to just keep reflooding the board. And if we can consistently control the board and make sure that they don't get to flood it, then we will be in the advantage state as we swing at their life and start chipping them down as fast as they're chipping us down. And as long as we consistently keep our life above 3 life, roughly, then they can't do much about it. But if we don't go after their life, they just get to keep rebuilding, and inevitably they have rush, so they'll be able to swing at us with multiple characters on one turn, even without a board state. And on top of that, they have ways of using like 5-drop Luffy, for instance, that can just put some Dawn on him, and now your blockers are useless. Likewise, they can do the same with like Diable Jambe to put it on their leader if they're Zoro or somebody like that. So we do need to be putting pressure on them so that they feel like they're slightly behind, and maybe it makes them make misplays. On top of that, it means that we could potentially close out the game. We could threaten to close out the game as fast and as strong as they can. Whereas against something like a control deck, we don't necessarily want to do that because that's just giving them resources and they want to go for late game, so they're going to be playing kind of defensively. And even if we are trying to play somewhat aggressively with it, we're not going to get that much out of there. And if we're not developing our board and making our board better as the turns go onward, then they get to just start removing our board state and we have to play from behind, which we're already kind of in the behind state. So against control decks, we never really want to be playing that kind of aggression to begin with, unless we just get one of the nuts draws, which would be like, oh, we got Coliseum for turn 1 play into multiple 2Ks into hand, but we can drop Kyros into Kyros the following couple of turns. Sorry, a little bit of cough. And then maybe that's kind of when we want to go a little bit aggressive, because we have multiple really sticky and hard to get rid of cards early on, and then our opponent isn't playing anything, so we just keep going for life. Yeah, maybe that's a route that you can look at. It's kind of rare, and it's only in a handful of matchups that I've ever seen myself doing something like that, but it is a possibility that can happen. It's not, but I would say that majority of the time against a control deck, we want to kind of take our time. So what are the type of matchups? We're going to go deeper dive into that concept here. Do you go first or second in these matchups? So when you're going against an aggro deck, something similar to Roran or Zoro, and we're looking at like red decks specifically, because you could talk about aggro decks in pretty much any color, but red is kind of the premier aggro color just due to the fact that they have such an abundance of rush cards. They now have better top end as well, so that their rush cards are not necessarily always just like, oh, okay, 3-drop 5k. They're now dropping like 8-drop 9ks that also put Dawn on stuff. Like that's very impactful late game card to rush with. And then in a couple sets, they're going to be getting like a 10-drop 13k that also blows things up. Roger's insane. Anyhow, when we're talking about Zoro, like the strategy that generally is embodied by Zoro is that you flood out with a lot of little characters, you start swinging 6k swings multiple times, and then the general route of how we beat it is by clearing the board by playing Kyros to pop a 1-cost, swing the Kyros in to kill something. They're not really going to be protecting their cards a lot because they don't have a lot to protect their cards with. They're playing with a lot of aggressively statted cards and a lot of very, very potent attackers. So their hand is not that many counter cards. So if you swing a 6 into a 5, yeah, that's probably 2 cards out of their hand in most scenarios. So that would mean that we want to aggressively clear the board and start getting chip damage in, because if they get to a point where they don't have a board and they have to keep rebuilding a board, getting in chip damage with our Kyroses because we don't have anything to swing into, keeping our blockers up and kind of loading up on 2Ks as much as we can prevent them from being able to close out the game. And that's kind of what aggro decks sometimes struggle with, is closing the game out. But like I said, we do have to be aware of the fact that they do have options like 5-drop Luffy's that can be unblockable, or Diamble Jambes. So, like, you have to be aware of those type of cards, but otherwise, it's clear board early, start chipping at life, and developing blockers for mid to late. Early blockers are also kind of an effective tool if you don't have the Kyroses, just because they can stall out so you can find stuff to clear board with. But your general win condition doesn't have to rely around your top-end cards. It more or less is about just making sure you maintain a board state while they have none. If you get to a point of playing your top-end, great, but for the most part, you don't really have to. Mid-game cards are going to be sufficiently statted and big enough that it's problematic for them to deal with. Now, on the flip side of that, how do we deal with something, do we want to, well, I should address, do we want to go first or second there? We always want to go second, even though they do get the advantage of being able to swing first by going there. If we make them go second, they both get extra cards, which is good for them because they need to refill the board more often. On top of that, they get more Dawn to swing into us, which makes our defending harder, and our curve is already, like I said, not optimal for the odd curve. Despite it playing on the odd curve, we don't get to use leader ability. So we actually start falling behind in resources, which is not what we want. So we want to go second as often as we can. They always want to go first. We want to go second. So we stay that way. And then when we go into like control-y matchups, we also want to go second because other control decks want to go second for similar reasons. They want to, either they have really good even curve, or they have an optimal play line by just getting more cards into their hand. So if that's the case, stuff like a Nell, who just wants to flood his hand, always wants to go second because he gets extra card, and he's perfectly fine with staving off early attacks from people or just taking it. So we would generally want to take second away from them because they also like to play on that for the similar reasons. They want resources. So because we are a resource intensive deck, we need more cards. We want to go second against a lot of control decks. Our win condition is actually playing for those late game cards this time. Our late game build path is built to be able to have such an efficient and awesome top end curve that it becomes very oppressive for a lot of decks. And a lot of decks that rely on certain types of removal, like an L, actually will find it difficult dealing with our top end because the real answer to it is Kingdom Come, for instance, or Rygo, whatever you end up calling it. It's a 6-drop, kill anything, but it reduces your life to 1 from wherever it is if it's above 1. We're not swinging at their life. So oftentimes, if they haven't done damage to themselves with like a Flampe to get some cards, they're losing at least 1, 2, sometimes even 3 cards if they try to Rygo on curve, which is fine by us. That's resources they lose to get rid of one of our resources. And they don't like doing that. So oftentimes you'll find a lot of them won't do that. And so guess what? We're now playing the, hey, you want to starve us? We'll starve you type of game. And we will be okay with that because they have to swing to get rid of our life. And we're just like, all right, if you want to get rid of our board, you're going to have to swing at it. And we're not going to give you that opportunity to do that while we're developing. So it becomes very easy to do that. Now, there are decks like Boa and Croc that are playing more of the mid-range, and even though their mid-range is very different, one's leaning more aggressive mid-range, one's leaning more control mid-range, the strategy just shift a bit. We do still always want to go second, like we do against either of these two type of deck options, but in those ones, it kind of shifts depending on what your opponent is playing. With the not Croc, I keep saying Croc, but Dofi, with Blue Dofi, they're going to be flooding the board a lot. They're going to be trying to develop a lot of characters, and they're just trying to overwhelm you with good swings and a lot of characters. They do have some spot removal, which can make them a very annoying matchup, but in general, they're just trying to overrun you. And as long as you can play for the board state, which is what you kind of have to do for a while until you develop a decent blocker line, you've cleared enough of their board and you've developed a decent amount of blockers, they then can't really do anything to you because they don't have a lot of ways. Like if they remove your blockers, that's great, but they're not developing any more bodies. And then on top of that, if they don't remove the blockers and they remove all the things that remove your blockers, they're developing bodies that can then be blocked. So they get kind of into a catch-22 of how they have to get out of it. Whereas with the Boas, they're training 1-for-1s, and because their leader swings, they're kind of in an advantageous state there. That's why that deck is actually kind of problematic for us, is that they get to use removal, they get a card back. Their removal cards give them cards back as long as they have 5 or less cards, which is crazy to me that that's how that works. But on top of that, they just have efficient removal cards like Red Rock that can remove anything, or Gravity Blade that removes 2 things, 6 and under. So because of that, currently in the state of things, they actually have that advantageous state. But we still want to go second because something like Boa wants more resources. Something like Dofi doesn't really care if he has resources, but he's aggressive. He needs to be building up a board state. And if we go second, it gives us more resources to deal with that board state. Both of our win conditions into both of those decks, because they're mid-range, is actually going to be our top-end cards. We are going to be looking towards the late game to win because there's not really a way that we can rush them down. Dofi is better at rushing us down, and Boa is built to manhandle decks that are trying to rush her down. So, yeah, we kind of have to go for starving and trading with them. And in many of these situations, if they are not aggro, we're going to try to starve out resources as much as we can from them. And that being the case, it can get a little bit difficult with decks like Boa that can just keep getting resources back by playing cards. So, we're looking at these matchups, but ultimately the breakdown for it: always go second because it gives us some more cards. Our win condition changes. If they are an aggressive early deck, we don't really need to play for our top end. If they are more of a mid-range to control, then top end is really going to be our only chance of winning. And then ultimately, we are going to try to starve them out of cards if we can, unless it doesn't really matter if they have cards because they don't have a lot of counter. In the case of aggro, we aren't going to try to starve them, but in terms of as the decks progress to wanting a longer win condition, we want to trade with them and starve them as much as we can. Now, when we're looking at the odd curve here, because this is going to be the ultimately the harder curve to play by a long shot. You're going to have to learn to play it. This is the one you need to learn to play more than the even curve. The even curve kind of plays itself. And now, like I'm saying, this is kind of in reference to the lists that I've posted before. I will post it in the description of this video as well, just so you can have a reference to cards that I'm talking about. But we're going to kind of give you an example idea of how we'd want to play the odd curve. Now, the only time, there is actually one scenario where we do want to go first, and that one scenario is against Gecko Moria, and that is if we can find, and we will declare first, but we are actively trying to find either Moncheries or Colosseums as our turn 1 play. And the reason for that is it puts us down to 4 cards, and that might sound counterintuitive, right? Like, why would we want to be on 4 cards? Well, we want to be on 4 cards because one of the earliest plays that Gecko Moria likes to do is on curve trying to get out a try to get out Perona so they can start stealing cards from our hands and making us lose resources. Well, if we're at 4 cards, that's just a pay 3 develop a 5k body, which is a vanilla stat line. It's a vanilla, not a vanilla stat line, but it's a stat line. Or is it a vanilla? Is that a vanilla stat line? That is a vanilla stat line. So like you're playing a vanilla 2k, and that's not very good. Like developing a vanilla 2k is not like emboldening in any way, shape, or form. So if that's the case, we're taking away some of the big pressure that they can be putting on us early on, and by the time that we actually start developing our hand later, it's not necessarily an optimum play for them to have to go for a Perona just to try to peel 1 card out of our hand. So early on, the way we combat it is by staying at 4 cards until about 5 or 7 dawn, because that's where they're trying to start developing big boards and stuff, and that's where we're going to try to start developing our removal pieces. So against the Moria play, we want a 1-drop that is not replacing a card in our hand, so that we can stay under a certain stay under a certain amount, so that when we get to the 5 to 7 on turns, we can start using our leader ability and getting card back and staying roughly in a range that makes Perona off most of the time. So for the majority of them, though, your Dawn 1 turn is very simple. You very rarely are playing that stage early unless you have an aggressive hand like we've kind of talked about earlier in the video, which would be like multiple Kiroses, and we're just trying to go, screw it, we're just going to try to rush face a bit. That's not necessarily an optimal play. It's not a suboptimal one if like you notice that on your opponent's turn 1 they don't develop anything, like they're just like, yep, pass on their 2 Dawn, and you're just like, all right, develop Kiros, pass, and then all of a sudden on their turn 2 they're just like, play Searcher, swing 8 at lead, right? Like, if they do that, then it's just like, oh yeah, all bets are off. We're just going to develop a Kiros on turn 5 again, or on our 5 Dawn turn, and we're just going to start going face. Because, yeah, you don't, maybe your hand is just chock full of 2Ks, but I'm now going to start chipping away at those 2Ks super early on, and you haven't developed any real threat to us. So we're going to put the threat on you. That's a rare situation that can happen, but it's not one that we are generally playing for. And what we are playing for on the odd curve here, turn 1, leader ability. That's the most optimal one most of the time. And that's just because that starts getting us cards, and that starts building, the advantage that our opponent has is that, oh yeah, they draw a card for turn 2. Well, if our turn 1 is we can't really develop anything and we're not trading 1 for 1, we just use leader ability and go up a card. Our second turn is going to be developing a Kiros, developing a Bardo. Really kind of depends on the matchup. If we feel like our opponent isn't going to be developing that much of a threat on their follow-up turn, we can develop a threat with Kiros so that we can start threatening their life a little bit, get some chip damage in. If we think our opponent's going to go a little bit aggressively and they're going to try to start beating in our face, something like a yellow-green Yamato, for instance, that wants to just start smacking face, if we really don't want to take that damage, or we think that they're going to do something like, oh man, they're on the even curve, so they're going to put 2 Dawn on leader, and then they're also going to make it banish, right? That's something we need to counter out of, and if all we have is 1 Bardo in hand, might as well play the Bardo then, right? So that would be kind of a situation where you want to play defensively there. Sometimes we do actually need to play very defensively on the odd curve, though, just because we don't have optimal plays going into 5, 7, and 9 in some of the cases. So if on, for instance, now, our 3 Dawn curve doesn't really have a whole lot of options. Rebecca Searchers are some options, Colosseum's an option if you found it, and then leader ability. And oftentimes, I get 2 1-drops, and I end up with 1 Dawn that I can't do anything with anyways. So when we are then looking at, or I get a 1-drop in leader ability, that's what I have. I have if you get 2 1-drops, you actually can leader ability usually. But if you have like Rebecca Searcher and that's it, and then it's like, all right, Rebecca Searcher leader ability, we fill up our hand and pass. That sometimes is the play. Like there's not a whole lot going on these first 2 turns on the odd curve, just because the curve itself is just not really tuned for what our deck wants to do. We don't get to develop both a Kyros and use leader ability, which kind of hurts. So it's one or the other, and sometimes it is develop a blocker like Bardo. Now, for the 5-drop turn, this is where 5-Dawn turn is kind of a little trickier. If you have the Sabo and you need to play defensively, easy play. Sometimes, now that we are running 2 Orlumbuses, you can play an Orlumbus and use leader ability. Not a bad play. You can use a Kyros to clear something with. You could do like clear. You could do Patchwork clear a 4-drop with Kyros, right? And then you get to use a leader ability. Not a terrible play. You can use Rebecca and Patchwork to clear something. Not a terrible play. Like, we have a lot more options on 5, but it's going to be more or less, this is definitively, all right, is my hand aggressive enough that I can actually clear board? If not, play a blocker. That's really what this turns into. At this point, you really hope you have stage out by this turn, and if this turn if you have Luffy and you need to set up for a Luffy the next turn, this is your final turn to put out a stage. This is the turn that if you haven't been able to search for it, or if you have searched for it and you haven't had the Dawn efficiency to play it, you need to play it this turn, because you need to be able to play Luffy on curve. Because when we go into 7 Dawn, our options are less so limited, but this is where we need to be taking control of the game. This is the turn where we need to start trying to develop board state. This is where we need to start trying to limit the impact that our opponent has on the board. So the general best turn here is a Luffy that can swing into anything. Because on this curve, he can kill basically anything. So we need our Luffy here. Like, this is where we need our Luffy on this curve. Like, he is super impactful for turning the tide into our advantage here. Because if our opponent's follow-up turn is spend almost all their Dawn to get rid of the Luffy we just developed, our 9-cost turn can be developing multiple characters really, really easily. So that's where this curve becomes really impactful. Is your 7 is your big impact. This is where you want to play Luffy because it takes over the board state. Worst case scenario, you play a Gravity Blade. Well, that's not worst case scenario. I don't like Gravity Blade on here because you're not doing anything else. But if you already have a developed board state of multiple blockers, Gravity Blade is not that bad. It gets rid of a couple characters. And if you really need to get rid of, if they have like 4 characters already, then yeah, maybe you need to, because some decks can cheat out a lot of characters by this many Dawn. So ultimately, on this turn is the kind of impact turn. 7 Dawn turn is where you start turning into your mid to late game. Your 9 Dawn curve is not terribly unique in that sense. It's generally, you want Aramaki is the best on curve play you can have, because Aramaki Patchwork gets rid of a 5-drop. If you already have a Hajrudin that you played the previous turn, Aramaki can get rid of a 6. With a Patchwork, it gets rid of a 9. You get rid of anything that's been played. But it's ultimately, Aramaki is the best play here just because he's a big blocker, he's a big boy, and it's just the best on curve. But otherwise, this is a Gravity Blade turn, set up a Luffy turn if you have another one, or just develop multiple characters, right? Like, you could do Hajrudin into a Kyros to kill a 5. That's not bad. If you have Colosseum already developed, both of them can swing into rested characters. That's pretty good. That's a pretty good swing turn. Or it's developed multiple blockers. If you can't tell, this is a very defensive curve for us, and that's just because we don't do well here in terms of the fact that at Dawn efficiency, until 7 or 9 Dawn, we don't really have a lot of ways of when we can actively use our leader ability unless we have some suboptimal plays to a degree, right? Like, because we're not using it on, if we have to use turn 1, we use our leader ability, right? Because we need stuff in trash. Because if we want to be able to use a Rebecca on 5, we need stuff in trash. And then we need to be countering out with Bardos if we have them so that we can get them back with her. But you know, oftentimes Rebecca is rough on this curve because we're not filling our trash up efficiently. Now, on the flip side, when we look at the even curve, this is much more beneficial to us. Hey, yeah, we can play a 1-drop on turn 1 and still use our leader ability, which means we are still putting cards in our trash potentially, as well as developing stuff. Same thing kind of goes for 4. If we wanted to, on the foregone curve, if we wanted to play a Kyros like we did on the previous second turn, we still have 1 Dawn to be able to use leader ability. Or we have 1 Dawn to put out our Colosseum, so the turn the Kyros comes out, he can actually swing into something. So, as you're looking at it, it's like, oh, we have a +1 Dawn, right? And because we're not attacking, that's why the even curve is so easy and so much better for us. We don't attack. Our leader can't attack. So we're never looking to be like, oh yeah, we could swing extra big at your face here. That's never an option. So the even curve becomes easy. Oh yeah, 1-drop card plus leader ability. 3-drop card plus leader ability. Rebecca on curve. 6 Cox card. So like our 6 through 10 is super easy as well. Hajruden, Aramaki, Kuzan. Super easy. Hajruden, Aramaki, Kuzan. Super easy play line. But that's like the optimal play line. Otherwise, we have options. Sabo leader ability Sabo. If you're not at the cap of numbers there already. If you're not already at like 7 cards in hand. 8 Dawn curve. Luffy leader ability. Right? Like that could enable our Luffy to restand. Because you can just choose not to get anything. If you have 5 cards in trash, you just choose not to get anything with the leader ability. Put 7, now your Luffy can swing twice on the turn he comes out. That's pretty impactful. On the 10 Dawn curve, you can use Aramaki plus a Patchwork or Aramaki plus a Toy Soldier. Like, you have a lot that you can do there if you don't have the Kuzan. Or if you can play them on curve, you can play it on curve, right? Like, even gives us so many more options and so many more play lines. I can't go over all of them, because there's just so many options now. But it also just enables us to use leader ability, which is one of the most important things about Rebecca, is being able to fill up your trash, and leader ability is the most efficient way to do so. So if we are actively seeking to utilize our best curve, even curve is what we want all the time. I don't think I need to go super in depth on what you can do on even. As I just mentioned, on turn 1, you can drop a 1-drop and leader ability. On turn 2, you can drop a 3-drop in leader ability. You could drop a Rebecca. You could drop multiple 1-drops in leader ability. Like, there's so many options when you have that much Dawn ability. And then when you go into 6, 8, 10, optimal curve is obviously Aramaki. It's going to be Hajruden, Aramaki, Kuzan. Like, that's just the optimal curve. But you have options, right? Like, oh man, maybe I've already dropped down my Kyros the previous turn, so on 6 Dawn, I have an Orlumbus instead, so we're going to play Orlumbus. Orlumbus is going to minus the Kyros. Kyros is going to stay alive because we'll rest our stage that we have, and then we'll play a Leo, rest leader, KO, whatever we just reduced. So now we actually have a setup for the next turn. If they have a wave getting rid of the Kyros, we still have the Leo, so our Orlumbus can get rid of stuff. So they need to get rid of the Orlumbus now, but that means our Kyros stays alive and gets past the turn that they can normally kill him on now. So you see how this can start folding out. This is now we're starting to get advantage, and even if they have removal, they have really tricky choices of what do we get rid of. The constant reduction or the character that is almost impossible for us to get rid of, we now have a window to get rid of. So you can start seeing play lines developing, and with the even curve, you just have more of them. That's just what it is. That's all this is you have more of them. You have a very straightforward curve here, right? 1-drop card on turn 1 or leader ability, which is the preferred one, so you get card advantage. Turn 2, you can drop a 3-drop, or you can drop multiple 1-drops, but that's really all you can do. On the 5 Dawn turn, you can play Sabo, is generally the best Dawn efficient card, or you can do Rebecca into something if you have it and use leader ability. You can see that there are some play lines here, but they're a little stickier, they're a little harder, they're a little bit less optimal. Whereas with these ones, we're getting optimal play lines that are then also enabling us to potentially use our leader ability, or we're just developing our board in a way that's super optimal. Turn 1, leader ability stage. Turn 2, Rebecca Kyros. Turn 3 into Hajruden. Turn 4 into Aramaki. Turn 5 into Kuzan. Wow, that's really easy to follow formula and recipe, and guess what? That generally clears and deals with everything that your opponent has played on curve, so it's actually kind of problematic for them to deal with such an efficient and useful curve. Whereas when we go over on this side, it's like, all right, we got some sticky scenarios. We need to see very specific cards to actually have some options here. Yeah, we have some more thought that we have to think into it, but it's also a lot more situational because we are somewhat playing from behind. We don't have as many resources. We're not drawing as many cards. It's less likely we're going to hit those optimal options on curve, and we have to kind of play for, like, not necessarily getting to play for filling our yard as much. We have to play a bit more defensively. So you can kind of see where these kind of happen. And ultimately, that's why the even is so much better. But I think that the true skill for a Rebecca player is being able to play on the odd curve and actually understanding your play lines and learning them. I can't really give you advice on more than just the generic idea that I gave you for it. And that's just because your matchup's going to change what's going to happen there. But if you ultimately practice the deck, I would often say that if it's not for a tournament and it's not for the locals, practice going first on the sim. That's the biggest thing I can advise you to do, because that is going to be the difficulty of learning Rebecca. It's also going to teach you how to play a little faster, because you're going to have to learn those combos, learn those play lines a little bit more efficiently, a little bit more consistently. So it's going to be teaching you the best effective ways of playing Rebecca, because you have to play from behind. Whereas this one just becomes easy. It just becomes straightforward. It just becomes like, all right, I know exactly what I do. Stage leader ability, Rebecca, Kiros, getting back a Bardo, Hajrudin, Aramaki, Kuzan. Bam, easy. Figured that out super easily. Oh man, I don't have those cards on curve. Well, let me look into some of these other cards. All right, Luffy on 8, use leader ability, fill up trash, swing twice with Luffy, clear 2 characters. Oh, Gravity Blade on 8, use leader ability, get a card. Oh, on 6 Dawn, let's do Sabo, leader ability. Oh, let's do Rebecca. Let's play Toy Soldier, Rebecca, get back Kiros, popping the character reduced by Toy Soldier. Right? Like, there's so many play lines that can be done on here, but, like, it's pretty easy to start seeing them pan out just because of, like, certain Dawn efficiency things we're at. And oftentimes, if you just can't figure out a play to do, if you have an odd-costed card, you just play the odd-costed card in leader ability, because leader ability is strong. And so if you have the Dawn for it, might as well do it just to get some more cards back. And as long as you meet the requirements to actually get the cards back. But outside of that, guys, that kind of wraps up my summary of how to understand Rebecca via the odd curve, even curve, a little bit of matchup kind of understanding of what you should be doing to play it, and then more or less how you should be picking your early turns, what cards you really want to see early on if you're looking for optimal hands. Like I said, an early Kiros is really good. Early Sabo isn't something bad. Rebecca's nice to see. But on the even curve, if you just see an opening hand that is going to be like Hajrudin, Aramaki, Kuzan, and then it's like 2/2Ks, take it. Just take it. That's such a good one on the even curve. On the odd curve, you want to see Kiroses. Like, that's just kind of the important card on the odd curve, because he helps develop. He is a consistent board state that can help you clear out board. That's essentially what the benefit of him on this curve is. And then Sabos are just the most efficient defenders and hand fixing. So when you're down resources, the best thing you can do is fix your hand. Sabo is pretty efficient. So that kind of does it, guys. And until the next video, I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful day. Bye, guys.